Hello and welcome to the another online session for Cambridge exam prep. This is teacher Rekha and today we are going to talk about writing again. But in today's class, we will move on to the other option of the second part, which is how to write a story. So without further ado, let's get started with today's class. But before that, just for your reference, here I have included one sample answer for the article task that we did in the last class. So you can pause the video here and go through the article to get a better understanding of how you should write an article for task 2. This is just a sample answer, which means your email should not correspond to it word by word. But if it's somewhat similar to it, then you're doing it correctly. One more thing I would like to add on is that I saw many of you have done the task, but at the same time, many of you forgot to give a good title to your article. And if I'm not wrong, I mentioned it clearly in my last video that for the article task, a title is a must. So please pause the video here, go through the task, and then move on to the next section. Okay, so now let's start with the summary about the second option of task 2, which is writing a story. First question is it a mandatory task? Is it required? No, it's not. You will get two options in which you have to choose one. As usual, word count is around 100 words. Make sure you always count your words. It needs to be minimum 100 words. Main characteristics for this task is you need to use an interesting or engaging language, right? The structure needs to be clear, not confusing. Clear structure means the flow in which a story actually moves on. The structure of your story should be like this. The first thing needs to be the beginning of the story, then the main part, and at last the ending of the story. The language that you are going to use for this task should be interesting. Try to use adjectives and adverbs to make it more interesting. Past verb forms are going to be used for this task. Most of the time you will use direct speech, and time expressions is also very important for this task. We will see how we can use this different language structures in our task. So part 1 of the writing exam in V1 preliminary is always an email, as I already told you. You can't choose this task, but in the second part of the test, you can decide if you want to write an article or a story. I already told you about this thing in the last video. In every story task, you get one sentence, which has to be the first sentence of your story, and the text has to be related to this. Your language should be neutral to informal. So please make sure that you are starting the story with the sentence that is going to be provided to you. So the first sentence of your story should be the one that is going to be given to you. So let's talk about what does a typical story task look like. Whenever you get ready for a writing task in the PET exam, you need to think about a few questions. These questions help you understand the task better and make a plan for your story. So the first question is, what is the situation? What do I have to include in my story? Who is going to read my story? Let's have a look at a typical example task and see how we can answer the questions that we already discussed earlier. So the question here is, your English teacher has asked you to write a story. Your story must begin with this sentence. As the plane flew lower, Lou saw the golden beaches of the island below. Now write your story. You can see that there isn't a lot of information, but we still have to check the task very carefully so we know exactly what to do. In the given sentence, a person called Lou is on a plane flying over an island and he is looking at the beaches. The plane is going lower, so it might be getting ready to land. This is the situation you have to start your story from, and everything you write has to be related to this beginning. The second question is a little bit more open than the first one because you can pretty much write about anything you like. The only restriction again is the first sentence and the situation that comes with it. You can make your story funny, sad, full of action or fantasy, and include whatever you can imagine, but connect it to the first sentence. Last but not the least, your English teacher is going to read your story. In other writing tasks, you need to be very careful with your language, but in a story, you are free. You decide if your characters use very informal English or if they are formal. Just remember, don't use rude language or words that are not in the dictionary. You see, there is a lot of freedom that you have when you write a story, but at the same time, you have to make sure that you focus on the topic in the first sentence and that you are careful with your language because the rules are not as strict as an email or article. Now, how to organize your story? The good thing about this writing task is that you can always organize them in the same way. It is a little bit like a good cooking recipe because it works every time. A good story usually has a beginning, a main part, and an ending. The main part is the most important one, so you want to make it longer than the other parts. Most of the time, we get to a structure that looks like this: first sentence or beginning, then the main part, paragraph 1, or main part, paragraph 2, and then the ending. Of course, you might have three main part paragraphs, but in most tasks, the structure with only two works very well. So now let's talk about the different parts of a story. Now we are going to find out what the different parts of a story typically look like, and I will give you some useful tips about good language that will help you get good marks. The first one is the first sentence or the beginning of the story. As I said above, in a pet story, you always have to start with a sentence that you directly get from the task. Don't change the sentence in any way, but simply copy it onto your answer sheet and begin your story from there. I recommend adding one more sentence to complete the beginning of your story. For example, our in our task, this could look like this. As the plane flew lower, Lou saw the garden beaches of the island below. The sun was shining brightly, and he said to the woman next to him, "I'm so excited about my holidays." When we look at the first sentence from the task, there are a couple of things that are not 100% clear. When we look at the first sentence from the task, there are a couple of things that are not 100% clear. For example, why was Lou on the plane? What island did he see? Why did the plane fly lower? In my second sentence, I tried to make things a little bit clearer. Lou was on his way to spend his holidays on the island, and the plane was getting ready for landing. In terms of good language, I used past continuous was shining, which we used to say what was happening in the background or at the same time as our main events. I also included an adverb, brightly, and an adjective, golden. which makes an action more interesting. And there is some direct speech. I'm so excited about my holidays. This brings the reader closer to the characters compared to indirect or reported speech. Always try to make sure to set the scene, give some background information in past continuous to introduce the main character or characters. Add some adjectives or adverbs as well as direct speech because this makes the reader feel more interested in your story and they want to keep reading. Now we moved on to the main paragraphs. So once we set the scene, we can move on to the main part of the story. Here we will try to develop the plot and all the main events happen in these paragraphs. You can decide on how many paragraphs you want to make, but in general you should be fine with 2 or 3 of them. For our example task, I chose 2 paragraphs. As soon as Luke got off the plane, he left the airport and took a taxi to the city center because he really wanted to swim in the clear water and sunbathe on the beautiful beach he had seen earlier. However, when he arrived at the beach, he saw that the weather was changing and 5 minutes later it was raining heavily. Lou ran into a bar and was surprised because someone shouted, "Hi, it's you again." I tried to let the plot grow a little bit in my first paragraph and at the same time create some excitement for the reader. Lou wants to go to the beach, but when I used the word however to start the second paragraph, it is clear that something must be wrong. Finally, I end my main paragraphs with a mysterious voice calling for Lou in the bar. The reader wants to know how the story ends. For useful language, you can find sometime expressions, for example, as soon as, when, 5 minutes later, as well as past perfect and past continuous. For example, had seen, was changing, was raining. These verb forms help us to give extra information about the main events of the story. In addition, there are interesting adjectives such as clear, beautiful, surprised, and adverbs really, heavily. Once again, these words help us make our story more interesting for the reader. It is also a good idea to use some contrast, for example, however, and surprising elements, just like someone shouted in your story, because again, you want to make the story as interesting as possible, right? So, in the story, the main part is the main paragraph or paragraphs. And then every great story has a great ending. So in this pet exam, you want to finish your story in a surprising and or funny way. So the reader is happy. Make sure that the ending is connected to the topic. Don't introduce new characters or let the story move in a completely different direction. Just write 1 or 2 last sentences and that's it. In my example story, I wrote this. There was the woman from the plane. They started to talk and became very good friends. It's a short ending with a little surprising element, the woman from the plane. It is nothing special or crazy, but it brings the whole story together in a nice way. That's all you have to do to make the examiner happy and get great marks. So now, in this part, I'm going to give you a summary of the different types of useful language for your story writing. As I told you earlier, we should use past verb forms for writing our story. For example, past simple, past continuous, and past perfect are the three most important verb forms when you write a story. Past simple describes the main events of your story. Past continuous describes what was happening at the same time as the main events. And past perfect describes what happened before the main events. So study these verb tenses and practice as much as you can. Now, time expressions. Time expressions put the events of your story in a sequence. When you use them in the right way, the reader understands what happened first and the sequence of events. Some examples of time expressions that you can use in almost every story are when, as soon as, immediately, before, earlier, until, while, after that, next day, next morning, etc., or X minutes, days, years later. Use one or two of these in every paragraph so the examiner is happy and gives you high marks. Now, adjectives and adverbs are like different spices in your food. Without them, everything tastes a little bit boring. So we want to make it as flavorful as possible. Just as with time expressions, always think about where you can use adjectives and adverbs to describe a person, an object, a place, or an action in more detail. Look again at my story with all the adjectives and adverbs highlighted. Did you notice that I did not overuse adjectives and adverbs, but two or three in every paragraph are already going to improve your story a lot? Now we moved on to the direct speech. Direct speech describes the things that somebody actually says in that moment. We always use quotation marks to show that we are using direct speech. Used in a story, it gives the reader the feeling of being closer to the action and the characters feel more alive. Always try to have a couple of sentences in direct speech in your stories. My examples are, he said to the woman next to him, "I'm so excited about my holidays." Someone shouted, "Hi, it's you again." Right? It is now your turn to practice story writing. Don't wait until it's too late. With every story you write, you feel more confident and ready for the exam. Practice the different kinds of useful languages, and step by step you will improve. I hope my lesson will help you, and if you still have any problem or questions, please feel free to come and talk to me. Do not forget to do your assignment online, and I will see you all in next class. Till then, take care. Bye-bye.